ग्लोबल स्किल डेवलपमेंट मिशन में आपका स्वागत है।
Now that we've determined the overall message for our design, the emotions that we want the design to convey, and so on, we can now get to work. As I said just a moment ago, we can start gathering up the typefaces, the imagery, the colors that are all going to support the message for the design. And as you can see here, we're going to start the process off by discussing type over the next handful of exercises. What I want to do right away, though, as you can see, is I want to get some terminology out of the way. And, there's a lot of confusion, of course, related to typography and the terminology that's used in typography. Interestingly, we can't even get professional typographers to agree on what terminology we should be using. But hopefully this exercise, this lesson, will at least get us started. The first one that I want to tackle is the term font versus the term typeface. A lot of people use these two terms interchangeably. Well, Norbert Florendo gives us this concise explanation. The font is what you use. The typeface is what you see. Okay, so in other words, the font is the file that you install on your computer. The typeface is what you're going to use inside your software. I hope that makes sense. So, in other words, a font is a container that holds a typeface. Nick Sherman gives us the analogy of songs being typefaces, while MP3s are fonts. If that works for you, that definitely works for me. So, in other words, fonts are files. They're the container or the carrier, either physical metal letters used back in the day on the printing press, or a digital file, of course, in the modern era. And as I just said a second ago, we install these onto our computer and use them. The typeface is what we see. It's what we actually get to see and enjoy. The typeface is the song in Nick Sherman's analogy. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. All right. Now, next, what about font families? I've heard the term font family before. What does it mean? Well, a font family, very simply, is a group of related typefaces. Okay? So, for example, the Gill Sans font family contains Gill Sans Light, Gill Sans Light Italic, Gill Sans Regular, Gill Sans Italic, Gill Sans Bold, I feel like a broken record, Gill Sans Bold Italic, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, so it's a group or a collection of related typefaces. Here's another example for you. The Arial font family contains Arial Regular, Arial Black, Arial Narrow, Arial Italic, and a whole bunch of others. Okay, so that's what a font family is. All right, what do we have next? Here's a big one. What's leading, what's kerning, and what is tracking? Have you heard of these terms before? Let's define them here so that we're all on the same page. First of all, let's talk about leading. All leading is the space between the lines of text within a paragraph, the vertical space between the lines of text within a paragraph. Let me give you an example. So I find myself inside my graphics application. Which application am I in right now? It doesn't really matter because all of our graphics applications, if they're worth their weight in salt, allow us to adjust the leading for our text. But just in case you're wondering, I happen to be inside Adobe Illustrator to show you this. And as you can see, I have a paragraph of text here sitting inside of a text frame, and I have my trusty character panel kicking around there over on the left-hand side. So the leading that we have, I just said a moment ago that the leading is the space between the lines of text inside the paragraph. So what I'm referring to is the space between all of these lines of text, the white space, okay? So I can adjust the leading using this option right here inside the character panel, okay? So for instance, I can reduce down the amount of leading, something like this, or I can increase the amount of leading, something like that. And of course, the more leading that I throw in there, the easier the text is to read. Ever notice on the back of your credit card statement or your credit card agreement, the leading, the text is always tiny and the leading is crushed way down because they don't want you to read the text. That's why we look at this and go, I don't want to read that. So anyway, this is what leading is. Are you curious to know where the term leading comes from? Sometimes people refer to it as leading, and I want to slap them on the wrist. It's leading. Where it comes from is back in the printing press days. They would quite literally take a strip of lead, a long strip of lead, and place it between all of the lead or all of the metal characters on the printing press to space out the lines of text. Next, we have kerning and tracking. Now, kerning and tracking are related, and they're actually frequently confused with one another. Both refer to the adjustment of space between characters of type, but let's take a look at kerning first. What kerning is the adjustment of space between pairs of characters. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So, by pairs of characters, of course, I'm referring to just two characters. And I'm not referring to the amount of space between two characters within a paragraph. Usually you're going to use your kerning inside headlines or larger text. Okay? So for instance, if we're looking at this text, and maybe I should zoom in on this text a little bit more, but this is one of those things that actually kind of drives me crazy because the more I look for it, the more I find it, and the more I find it, the more I want to fix it, and the more I fix it, the more I look for it, and the more I look for it, the more I want to fix it, and it's just this endless cycle of insanity for myself. So at some point I have to draw the line. But for instance, I'm just looking at the word headline. And inside the word headline, to me anyway, I could be nuts, but to me the E and the A look closer together than the H and the E, if you just look at that for a second. Or, for instance, the E and the R, the spacing between the E and the R in the word average, it's different than the amount of space between the A and the V. Okay, so what we can do is we can adjust this space. And I really got to stress that you would really only want to do this for large headlines. So, for instance, I'm going to drop my cursor between the H and the E inside the word headline. And then over inside the trusty character panel, we have this option right here for our kerning. Right now, my kerning is set to auto, which means it's going to try and adjust it automatically for me. But just like we saw with leading, I can get in here and I can make some adjustments. So, for instance, what I could do is I could manually reduce down, or I suppose actually we're increasing the amount of kerning in my case here inside the headline between specifically the H and the E. So I've reduced down the amount of space, bringing them a little bit tighter together. Same with the D and the L. I could drop my cursor in there and then just drop down that amount of space that we have in there. And you can see my characters are shifting very subtly. It's immensely subtle. It's very subtle. And this is why it drives me crazy. I'm sitting down and I'm watching a movie and I'm watching the credits at the beginning of the movie and I'm going, they didn't adjust the kerning on that. How could they do that? It's a crime against humanity. What were they thinking? This sort of thing. And it winds up driving you crazy. So in any regard, we can certainly reduce down the amount of space. You could always increase the amount of space between two specific characters as well. Let me crank this way up so you can have a decent example of what I mean, something like that. As you can see, again, it is immensely subtle. So in any regard, there we go. That's the kerning. I really have to stress here that it's the space between two pairs of characters which you're going to use in your headlines. The other thing that I wanted to mention very quickly is if you wind up using all caps, something like this, then you're definitely going to want to use some kerning to get in here and try and average out the amount of space between all of the characters inside your headlines. Finally, we have tracking. Tracking differs from kerning in that the tracking adjustments that we make are going to be for a group of characters, not two specific characters. So it's the amount of space for groups of letters or characters within a block of text. So, and once again, I got to stress this, not pairs of characters like we saw with kerning, but instead blocks of text like an entire paragraph. So I'm going to grab this entire paragraph of placeholder text. Over inside the character panel, it's going to be this option right here. So I can incrementally increase the amount of space between all of the characters inside the paragraph, perhaps something like this, or I could crank it way up, perhaps something like this, giving it more air inside the paragraph, increasing readability, making it easier to read. But sometimes it can get too airy, too much white space, too much tracking inside our paragraph. If I crank this way, way up, it gets tough to read. And of course, if I go and undo that and then start reducing down the amount of tracking that I'm using inside my block of text, again, we could very well run into some readability issues, okay? Perhaps something like that is a little bit extreme. But in any regard, that's the difference between tracking and kerning. So there we are, the terminology of type. We now understand the difference between fonts and typefaces. We understand what a font family is, and we also learned about leading, kerning, and tracking.